Furiosa from George Miller. It's a prequel to Mad Max Fury Road about the origin of its fearless imperator. This movie tells the story of Furiosa, formerly played by Charlize Theron and now played by Anya Taylor-Joy. The story covers the key parts of her life starting from when she was a little kid, separated from the Green Place, leading all the way up to her becoming Immortan Joe's imperator. As a child, Furiosa is taken by one Dementis, played by Chris Hemsworth, who leads a biker horde to besiege and plunder valuable territories throughout the wasteland. With her eyes on Dementis and an unquenchable thirst for revenge, Furiosa makes it her mission to make him regret taking everything away from her. So there are a couple of core subjects and themes here, but the main one is in fact revenge. Furiosa was robbed of everything she loved and thrown into a dark world where she has to drive war rigs and fight off raiders for a tyrannical leader. She wants her life back, but the next best thing is Dementis. For much of the film, it doesn't feel explicitly like a revenge movie. She spends a lot of it either in captivity or working as a mechanic at the Citadel, which of course gives us a glimpse of how she became so resourceful and gear-headed. This film is broken up into chapters, each focusing on a different key part of Furiosa's origin, though they're all part of the same story. It's not like Inglourious Basterds, where the chapters separate different characters' stories that all end up connecting. The story probably could have been told without breaking it up into chapters. It feels like this choice was only made to justify the movie having a really long prologue. That way they can say, oh, it's just the first chapter, just be patient. It was a cool idea, but I think I honestly would have just preferred a standard 3-act structure with a shorter intro. Naturally, this movie carries a lot over from Mad Max Fury Road with its grungy, over-the-top savagery, its occasional cheesy camera techniques, its historical references, and of course, its demolition derbies. This movie is definitely less twisted metal than Fury Road was. That movie was just packed to the brim with vehicles and destruction. This one has its car chase chaos, but definitely not as much. It took around an hour to really hit the road, and even then, it just wasn't quite as unrelenting. The same can be said about the overall savagery. It's still over the top, but it just feels like a slight step down from the last movie. Coming from Fury Road, I was expecting this movie to be very action heavy, and it has plenty of it, but I think that expectation made this movie feel pretty sluggish. The long periods of stagnation feel much more evident, especially during the first couple of chapters. I think it might have felt less sluggish had our protagonist spoken more. Much like Mad Max, Furiosa doesn't really talk a lot in this movie. While it totally makes sense for her to be pretty soft-spoken considering what she was exposed to growing up, it would have been cool to listen to her talk a little bit about the things that she's endured, considering that this movie was a bit less action-packed. But this movie definitely wanted to avoid being emotionally driven. It doesn't want to soften up the viewer and make them go, oh, Furiosa, I had no idea how much pain you carried. It doesn't want that. That becomes very clear during the parts of the movie that could have felt very sad, but the camera basically just glances right over them to keep the tone of the movie feeling pretty lively overall. This would normally be something that I would consider to be a really big shortcoming, but for this really edgy world, it totally makes sense to keep things feeling merciless. The post-apocalyptic world building takes inspiration from various points in ancient history, especially ancient Rome. The reign of Immortan Joe seems pretty derivative of the age of the Roman Empire and the reign of Augustus, who for some time was the sole ruler of Rome while maintaining the illusion of valuing the traditions of the Roman Republic, to avoid suspicions of his monarchical aspirations. While it isn't totally parallel, Immortan Joe similarly maintains the facade of a redeemer, even calling himself one in Fury Road, when in reality, he's a ruthless leader who wants to be worshipped. Augustus was even once referred to as an imperator, which is of course the title given to Furiosa that originated from the Roman Republic. There were also many Roman officials and leaders that had their own band of bodyguards and escorts that were referred to as the Praetorian Guard. This movie introduces the character Praetorian Jack, who was more of a commander than a bodyguard or an escort, but nevertheless he bears an ancient Roman title. To top things off, Dementis even rides a chariot of motorcycles. But George Miller doesn't stop at ancient Rome when channeling inspiration from ancient history. Dementis is also a fan of modernized versions of torture and execution used during the Middle Ages, substituting horses with motorcycles. And him and his biker horde feel like Vikings more than anything, which is interesting because their opponents are the ones that are seeking Valhalla. It's such a cool creative choice to derive so much from ancient history because in this lawless post-apocalyptic setting, the world has regressed to such primitive behavior, which makes sense under such circumstances. The primitive nature of this world could have been much more modernized, but sculpting it around these very familiar historical cultures really gives these films some zest. It kind of feels like a cool tip of the hat to the famous words of George Santayana: "Those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it." This movie dives a little bit deeper into the world established in Fury Road. We get to see some of the other outposts that were name dropped in that film. One of those places was really cool. Though they were just VFX renders, it was cool to see more of the world beyond the Citadel and the barren desert. So when the first trailer for this movie dropped, a lot of people were dunking on the CGI and VFX, saying that it all looked really mediocre. Having just rewatched Fury Road the night before seeing this movie, I kind of just feel like most people don't remember that movie very well. It had its share of subpar VFX and occasional footage that was obviously green screened. I know there is something to be said about that movie being 9 years old now, but some of that weirdness didn't feel accidental. The movie had lots of cheesy looking zooms and sped up footage, making for some really campy vibes. This movie continues that trend, honoring the foolishness that it had established for this world. I did also see George Miller's comments about his choice not to de-age Charlize Theron for this movie and instead recast her. If the VFX quality is a reflection of the film's limitations, then it was probably a good idea to bring in Anya Taylor-Joy. I liked her as Furiosa. Again, she doesn't really speak or emote very much, so there's not a whole lot to report on her performance. It's a fine performance, there's just not really anything to write home about. But she fits the role well, and that's all that really matters. This is a great character, she just doesn't really have that big of shoes to fill. Chris Hemsworth was the real star of the movie. Dementis is a very flamboyant character, and for the first couple of chapters, he really steals the show. This character's vibrance was crucial for keeping the movie interesting, considering how little flair Furiosa had. Dementis was honestly a much better antagonist than Immortan Joe was in Fury Road. He's loud, he's sloppy, he's twisted. He was the villain this franchise needed. With George Miller hinting at the potential of more movies coming, I hope that the biggest takeaway from this one is that they need antagonists that reflect the wicked nature of the world they've built. So even though this could be the last we see of Furiosa in the Mad Max world, I think it's a good installment that clearly indicates a promising future for the franchise. It shows us that George Miller still has plenty of juice left in him. Despite not being a perfect spin-off, it still has a lot to enjoy. It might not provide exactly the same amount of bedlam as the original film, but overall, it's pretty solid. It's a good time. If you loved Mad Max Fury Road, then you will definitely have to see this one. And if you haven't seen that movie, what are you doing? Go watch that movie and then go see this one if you liked it. Unless, of course, you're just really not a big fan of action flicks. If you really prefer stories that are driven by characters' emotions, then you probably won't enjoy these films. Thank you for watching this review. If it brought you any value at all, please give it a like. It really does help the channel grow. I'll see you later this week with my review of Hitman.